Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be Torath Mosheh versus religious claims. So this topic came up from a question I received recently. And the question mainly, I think the core part of the question mainly being, well, how do, Torath Mosheh Jews, for example, basically, deal with, religious claims, especially ones of different people claiming to be prophets, people claiming that, this proves this. How do Torah Mosheh Jews disprove something in this area? Now, the best way to look at it is from a different angle, that essentially there's no real reason why a Torah Mosheh Jew has to disprove a claim made by someone of a religious nature, especially when it comes in the area of someone claiming to be a prophet, especially, if you look at the English view of a prophet. And one of the reasons for this is because if you look at ancient Jewish culture and text, the concept that most Westerners or even most non-Jews have of a prophet is completely different than what the Torah's position is, as well as what has existed throughout the time of Torath Mosheh. Essentially, when most people think of prophets, they think of people who, claim to be predicting the future, come out of kind of nowhere. And predominantly, what you're looking at, pretty much in all cases, you're looking at someone who claims to have had a personal revelation, meaning that someone claims that a certain God spoke to them, a certain angel spoke to them, things like that, or that they sat in meditation and they came up with different ideas and saw certain revelations that made things clear for them. And the reality is, as far as Torah Mosheh goes, we know to basically ignore these kind of situations and claims and to stay away from them, essentially. And I'll explain why. When looking at it from the Torah Mosheh perspective, what you basically have is religious claims on one side, going one way from the nations, and then you have Torah Mosheh going in the direction of Torah Hashem. And in modern times, for example, Torath Mosheh is essentially kept by Jews who are of Mizrahi, Temani, Sfaradi, Maghrebi, Ashkenazim, who are Orthodox, Hasidim, Haredim, and Habashim, Ethiopians. These are essentially the different groups that keep Torath Mosheh. And there are other groups within these different groups. For example, you have the Bnei Menashe, who I would normally term, within these different groups, being that they come from, from Israelis who migrated it further into different areas. But essentially, this is the landscape that you'd be looking at. And now I'll explain why this landscape exists the way it does, and why Torath Mosheh Jews fall within the realm of Torath Mosheh, which is something where we would stay away from religious claims and lone prophet claims and blind faith claims and different claims by people who are magis, gurus, and priests and things like that. So when dealing with the real issues, we have to kind of say, okay, well, what exactly, and I've dealt with this in other videos, what exactly is Torath Mosheh and how exactly was it received? So here's where the real issue lies. The basic claim of Torath Mosheh is that at a certain point, the people of Israel, after being witnesses to a number of events that took place in Egypt and Mitzrayim, after being avadim there, being enslaved there, essentially were brought to a particular mountain called Har Sinai. And at that mountain, basically they were told to prepare for several days. And essentially after that third day, what happened was that the creator of all things, the source of creation, caused a situation that is completely different than any claim out there, for example. And that singularity is, the fact that all of the people of Israel, all of Am Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, and also the Erev Rav who were there with them, were made Nevi'im. Now, what do I mean by the fact that they were made Nevi'im? Nevi'im in Hebrew is the closest thing. In English, you might say like a prophet, but generally speaking, a prophet doesn't mean someone who, for example, lives this aesthetic lifestyle, or for example, predicts the future, things like that. Essentially, in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, being a Navi essentially means that the creator of all things elevated all of the people of Israel to a level of insight above what normally is like, seen and experienced by our natural senses. Meaning that essentially, when every individual was made a Navi, they were able to see a certain reality of Hashem at whatever level that they were at. So this is different than the idea that, for example, that most people have that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe ben Amram, or in English people call Moses, was the prophet of Israel, and that he was basically having this experience, and everyone else is kind of there, just kind of hanging out, things like that. But essentially, everyone was made a Navi that day. Every person who was at that site at that time was brought up to this level above normal human reality, for example, and was able to experience to whatever level they had for themselves the ability to experience the creator of all things, which basically shook up a lot of people and caused the people to say, hey, look, Moshe ben Amram, you go talk to Hashem because what we just experienced is too much. You go and handle that. Essentially what they had experienced was the fact that the creator caused them to hear and see and experience 10 things that the creator said. And this is essentially, what in Hebrew is called the Eseret HaDibrot, or in English people call the Ten Commandments, but essentially that the people heard the voice of Hashem and saw the voice of Hashem. As I mentioned in previous videos, that other, a lot of sources talk about the fact that there were those who saw the words of Hashem being written in the air like fire or lightning. And when you have a situation like this, the difference being that it isn't one person claiming it, it isn't like a small group of people claiming it. You're talking about over several million, a couple million people who had the same experience and walked away claiming the same thing at whatever level that they were at. Now, the thing that's important to note about this doesn't mean that they didn't have faults, because one of the things that's clear in Jewish, text and discussion about this is that anytime a person is brought to a higher level, whatever challenges they have in life, whatever difficulties they have in life, whatever bad parts of their life also get raised up. So it's like, you've heard people say the Yetzer Hara, for example, the evil inclination, that, both, as far as Jews are concerned, that people are created with two. One was the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination, and Yetzer Ra, the evil inclination, and that both of them are part of what makes each individual, and that we have to learn how to, strengthen the both sides in the right way and use them the right way correctly. But essentially, when the Yetzer Tov is brought up to a higher level, so is the Yetzer Ra. So essentially what happens is that if all of the people, became Nevi'im, that completely changes the scenario than when you talk about religious claims where one person comes out of the desert or comes out of a cave or comes, out of this situation of having this, one individual experience that they claim, and then everyone else is left to say, well, I don't really know if that happened or not. I wasn't even there. And this situation is completely different. This is a mass revelation. So what this means is that Torath Mosheh was experienced by all of those who can be considered to be the wise of the people of Israel. That, the person who, was, for example, if you will, closer to Hashem, experienced it at a higher level, but experienced it just as much as the person who was at a different level. But not just, for example, like, let's say the wise, the old, people's parents, and, someone saying, okay, my father told me he experienced this. This is a situation where even the children experienced the situation became Nevi'im. Essentially you had families that experienced it, women, men, children, fathers, grandfathers. So you're looking at about 3 to 4 generations, especially given the fact that in ancient times people could marry a lot younger. You have a situation where you could have 3 to 4 generations, experiencing this experience at Mount Sinai. And what that means is that you have a situation where someone can say, look, this isn't just the fact that my father experienced it, my grandfather experienced it, my uncles experienced it, my aunts experienced it, my mother experienced it, her sisters experienced it, I experienced it, my children experienced it, so on and so on. Now, the question could be asked, okay, well, why would Hashem, give the people of Israel this mass revelation? Well, first of all, because it was offered and and our ancestors accepted it. That's the first thing. The other thing is that the Torah makes it very clear when it makes the following statement, with that basically Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu passed to the people of Israel. It says, so what essentially translated would mean, you were shown so that you would know that Hashem is Elohim and that there is no other with him. Now, this is the important part. It isn't like that you should believe, that you should know. Because knowing something and believing something, especially the way the English works, are two different things. This is a situation where blind faith completely goes out the window. We don't want blind faith. We want to be able to know that this event happened. We want to know what the truth is about the situation. We don't want a situation where we have to guess and say, maybe my father said this happened. No, you experienced it too. And the minute that you have 4 or 5 generations experiencing all at the same time and different levels of people experiencing it, the minute that it goes to, like, let's say 1 generation later, you still have people alive who said, yeah, I was there, I saw it, and people who wrote things down and said, okay, this is what I experienced. And the fact that when you disperse the people of Israel, even after the exiles, every location where there were Jews, dispersed, especially ancient Jewish communities, even modern ones, everybody came back with the same story and the same text about what happened, meaning that the text simply serves to state the oral information and the actual historical experience itself. The text is there to basically say, okay, this is what we say happened orally and, intellectually, and, the text simply is the backup for that. Now, going to the modern day, there are only 3 paths that get you back to Mount Sinai, to the giving of the Torah in this method. First of all, you have Torath Mosheh Jews, you have Karaites, you have Samaritans. Now, the majority of Torah-keeping Jews that that exist, or Torah-keeping Israelis or Yisraelim that exist in the modern era, are going to be Torath Mosheh Jews. There's a small minority of people called Karaites, and even smaller minority called Samaritans. And generally speaking, based on how the Torah tells you, that essentially, if the majority is Torath Mosheh Jews who keep the Torah, that's the people who've been keeping it correctly. Where the other groups have had different things that they've kind of lost or not kept correctly, or they've kind of gone their own way. But the thing is that these are the only three paths that get you back to Mount Sinai, meaning that if a person wanted to say, I want to go back and find out what happened in Mount Sinai, you've only got three choices. You've got Torath Mosheh Jews, Karaites, and Samaritans, and you've only got three Torahs that can exist in these communities: a Torath Mosheh, community Torah, and a Karaite Torah, which are essentially the same, or exactly the same. And you have a Samaritan Torah, which has about 6,000 differences between the Karaites and the Torath Mosheh Jews. But, the Samaritans, their differences are mostly, choices of words, as I've mentioned before, and it's not something that changes the text, except for in two places where their Torah claims that the place that the temple is supposed to be built is on Har Gerizim. But there's only about 1,000, Samaritans that exist right now. There's also a number of issues with them that they had such a small community about 100 years ago. There was only about 200 of them, and they intermixed within the same families for so long that there's a number of genetic problems that exist. And also, their last descendant of Pinchas, a Cohen who was promised to have his line continue on, basically forever. Their last descendant of his passed away a number of years ago. So, you can kind of put them aside. Karaites, same thing, small numbers, things like that, different issues, mostly not heard of as much outside of the Jewish community. And essentially what that leaves you is Torath Mosheh Jews. Now, this is important to note when you start talking about, okay, well, what about people who just show out of nowhere and say that they're a prophet and that they have a word from, their God or whatever? Essentially, if it doesn't match the Torah, the written Torah and the oral Torah that was given at Mount Sinai, essentially the Torath Mosheh Jew, and even Karaite and even Samaritan practice is to ignore those people because of the fact that the Creator said to ignore those people when they come with these claims that don't match the written Torah and the oral Torah that was given at Mount Sinai. Now again, the Karaites could argue about the oral Torah part, but they have something called Sevel HaYorusha or Hekesh, which is essentially an oral Torah, but they say it was passed down from father to son, and if you ask, okay, well, how far back does it go? That's where you may get some tricky answers from them on that area. So then let's kind of wrap that around one more time. And I want to make sure I stress this point, especially given that the question I was asked. And essentially the question would be, okay, well, how do you disprove something, else that was brought in? Like, for example, you have Christianity, Islam, a lot of different other religions. They, let's say that they come to a Torath Mosheh Jew and say, okay, well, this is the truth. You have to believe this. This is what the truth is. Well, the first thing we would say is, okay, well, this doesn't match the Torah that all of the people of Israel, during a mass revelation, received at Mount Sinai. It doesn't match the written Torah. It doesn't match the oral Torah that came out of that mass revelation of about four generations standing at the same place with millions of people. And you have this one claim over here that someone may make with like one person coming out of a cave or a desert or whatever, coming out of left field saying, okay, well, this is the truth now. And everything they say, or even part of what they say, contradicts the written and the oral Torah. Torath Mosheh Jews know to ignore that. That didn't come from Hashem. Because if it came from Hashem for the people of Israel to do, it would have to go back through that line of, for example, mass revelation. So, for example, let's say that Hashem decided, I want to change things that I gave the people of Israel. I want to make sure that I change it. Well, then Hashem would have to basically bring back a mass revelation and do it all over again. And that's the only way you can go back to like upset what had happened the first time. But when you have one person showing up saying, okay, I did this, and even the interesting thing, let's say you have a person who comes out, says that they're a prophet, and they write nothing down themselves. Well, then you can't say you outshine all the previous like Nevi'im that existed, especially, and again, this is the important point, when the Torah was given at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, the entire nation of Israel became Nevi'im. So one person versus a million or more people becoming Nevi'im, becoming prophets, is completely different, and it's not even comparable. It's like apples and oranges, essentially. And that's the way that a Torath Mosheh Jew would take this. That essentially someone coming with these claims, it'd be like apples and oranges. Okay, we don't eat apples over here. If that's what you want to believe, based on blind faith, without any kind of, backup whatsoever, without any kind of support, we don't accept that. Hashem spoke to our ancestors directly, several generations, and when we look through the generations of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, we find that everybody from ancient Jewish communities had the same claim about what happened, even if they were separated by miles and generations of being in exile. So a Jew, for example, in Yemen, who never met a Jew from Poland, had the same claim when they were brought to Israel here, even though they were separated by about 2,500 years. So going back to the point of the prophets, the Nevi'im, one of the Nevi'im, known as Yeshayahu, or people in English say Isaiah, mentioned the following. In part of his writings, he mentioned, "Letoro walith'udo im lo yamru kadavar hazeh asher en lo shohar." Translated, what this means is to the Torah and the Tu'udah. The Tu'udah is almost like it could be the revelation, it could be the identifier. In modern Hebrew, we call our ID cards Tu'udat Zuhud, with the Tu'udah, meaning like this is what identifies you or like witnesses to you. So, something, the revelation, the, tradition, if something doesn't speak like this, then there is no shachar, or there is no dawn in it, meaning it doesn't transfer from darkness to light. So this is, in conclusion, the way that I would handle this question. I don't have to really get into specifics about any particular religious claim because of the fact, and I do sometimes, mainly because there are certain issues that missionaries, for example, especially Christian missionaries, bring against Jews, and that's one of the reasons I do a lot of those. But when it comes to any religious claim, of any matter, if it doesn't match the written Torah and the oral Torah that was received at Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, by all of the people of Israel as a part of a mass revelation, we're basically told to ignore it. That came from the creator himself. So if the creator himself is saying ignore something, and everybody were prophets, who received it, and they passed it down through generations, and it's proven itself to be true, amongst Torath Mosheh Jews for like thousands of years, then we don't need to really even consider something that comes out of left field from someone who has this religious claim or religious claim to an experience. It's something that we can pretty much ignore and keep going with life. So essentially, I think that answers the core of the question, because again, one of the things I want to bring up before I close is that anyone can claim to have done miracles. Anyone can claim to have had this religious experience on their own, and someone who wasn't there to see it can say, "Well, I don't know. How do I know all that was true?" Yeah, I don't have any proof behind that. And that could be of any claim, including the Torath Mosheh claim. Someone can say, "Well, I wasn't there. I don't know." But the thing is, a person can analyze it. Where if a person says, "Okay, well, this miracle proves something," the Torah is very clear that miracles by themselves don't prove anything, because the question you would face is, well, what's a miracle? Who's to say that's a miracle? Who's to say that this person just doesn't understand how the natural world works and is just simply using it or manipulating it based upon his knowledge that I don't personally have? Miracles, are not enough to base it upon. And that's one of the reasons that the Torah was given the way that it was, because then it puts in perspective what exactly is something that is a miracle. And also the proof is that miracles don't prove anything. That the knowledge of Hashem is what proves something. And that goes way beyond miracles. It goes way beyond, some personal experience. And that's one of the reasons that we would ignore that and don't have to go through and disprove it. Basically the proof is in the way the Torah was received. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. So thank you for listening. Take care and bye.